Previously, on the life story of Johnnie Walker, we saw how he started out life, how he saw through the interwar period, and how he'd managed to take command of the 36th Escort Group and safely escort the majority of convoy HG-76 through some of the heaviest U-boat attacks seen on the Gibraltar to UK route thus far. Now we continue. Whilst ashore after the harrowing experiences of escorting convoy HG-76, Walker had made a series of recommendations for future convoy missions as follows. 1. Aircraft are absolutely invaluable for anti-submarine work. There should be shore-based patrol planes for hunting down U-boats, and carrier-borne fighters for destroying the Focke-Wulf bombers on homing patrols. Audacity, her staff and pilots put up a matchless performance. 2. Every effort should be made to provide convoys with 2 protective screens, an outer and an inner. By day, the outer screen sights U-boats on the surface further away from the convoy and can attack inoffensive striking forces well clear of the merchantman. By night, U-boats are forced to attack from between the screens, or at least to penetrate both. 3. By day, all escorts should be used as striking forces for offensive lunges away from the convoy, attacking U-boats detected as far away as 30 miles. 4. The 36th Escort Group's Operation Buttercup is a sound plan despite my putting it into operation on the wrong side on one occasion. But Snowflake illuminant rockets are a menace in the convoy. I am well aware that merchant ships are fitted with tins to turn night into day, but I feel strongly that there can be no guarantee that snowflakes will not be fired at exactly the wrong moment. Neither can we legislate for the regrettable tendency of some ships in an emergency, real or imaginary, to fire everything, drop everything, and abandon ship. These recommendations were received with varying levels of welcome. The third point, especially about everybody going on the offensive, meeting significant opposition, largely on the grounds of issues with the second point, that being that although more and more escorts were coming online, there were still nowhere near enough of them. But although not all of these ideas would be implemented widely, at least in the short term, Walker was of course free to run as many of them as he could on his own convoys. But now, with a reduced 36th Escort Group, convoy HG-82 was heading for Gibraltar, expecting a relatively quiet run. The U-boats seemed to all be living it up on the US East Coast in April 1942, but at 21:30 on the 14th, that illusion was shattered when a signal came in from the Admiralty based on ultra-intelligence. A U-boat had been signalling in the area that the convoy was about to pass through. Stork had taken up a guard position at the rear of the convoy, which was where U-boats tended to prefer to attack, but no less than 15 minutes after the warning had been received, Vetch, which was a few miles ahead and to port, picked up a contact on radar. At first, she thought this was the fellow corvette Pentstemon, which was leading the close-in screen for the convoy. But the radar echo was moving diagonally to the convoy's line of advance and closing in on it. Schooled in Walker's investigate first and tell everyone about it later school of thought, Vetch hauled about to investigate, and seeing something moving rapidly through the water, she fired a star shell to better identify it. In the flickering glow of the floating illumination, she saw U-252 making best speed toward the merchant ships. The submarine was quick off the mark. Scarcely had Vetch's crew recognised the threat than the submarine was diving, leaving a pair of torpedoes in her place, which were heading straight for the corvette. The escort decided to just charge at the contact point. Turning at this stage would just expose more of the ship, and the torpedoes ended up passing down her side close enough that she could have been transferring personnel or mail to another vessel, and the motorised explosives would have passed right between them. In the rush, Vetch had partially forgotten the bit about telling everyone else what she was doing. She had reported a submarine contact a mile away, and then she'd reported that the submarine had dived, but had given no indication of the submarine's location or what Vetch was doing to respond to it. But one of her machine gunners had opened up on the submarine as it dived, and so Stork had headed for the flashes of tracer. To get a better understanding of the situation, Walker ordered Vetch to fire an illumination rocket, and, upon seeing it, altered Stork's course to join her. The sloop and the corvette began a hunt as the rest of the group forged ahead with the convoy. Stork had just reached her smaller compatriot when, for some reason, the submarine popped up like a cork less than a mile ahead. Vetch's crew were now like a bunch of overly enthusiastic terriers and promptly charged, well, at least as fast as you can charge in a flower class, blazing away with their 4-inch deck gun. Of course, on the surface, the Type 7 U-252 was actually a little bit faster than Vetch and began to edge away into the darkness. The small profile of an end-on Type 7 at night at range proved rather difficult to score a hit on, though, and neither Stork nor Vetch was able to score a direct blow, although quite a few shells landed close nearby. These near misses seem to have persuaded the submarine to try diving again. That proved to be a fatal mistake, as with its speeds now significantly reduced, Vetch was able to rapidly overhaul the submarine, and with a contact on its ASDIC, dropped a series of depth charges. Between Stork and Vetch, a total of 50 depth charges were sent into the sea, and during the last run, the Stork's ASDIC operator reported that the echo he was looking at was changing. It was breaking up and no longer moving forward, probably now wreckage. Soon enough, this was confirmed, as indeed wreckage began to bubble up to the surface, showing significant signs of sudden and violent trauma. Either a depth charge had pretty much nailed the sub dead on, or else damage from the more distant explosions had sent U-252 plunging below crush depth. Either way, at least for the crew of the sub, it had been quick. With investigations wrapping up just before 0100, the two ships now needed to catch up with the convoy, which had been left with just Pentstemon, Gardenia and Convolvulus to protect them. For the slightly swifter Stork, this was a 4-hour run. For poor old Vetch, it was considerably longer still. Walker now inaugurated a practice that all ships under his command would subsequently follow. Any ship that sank a U-boat was allowed to splice the main brace, that is, issue an additional rum ration after their success. Walker was already writing up a lessons learned document. Amongst other things, he emphasised the need for modern radar of the correct type. Vetch had a Type 271 unit which had spotted the sub initially at about 4.5 miles, but Stork's Type 286P unit hadn't been able to see anything despite having the group's most experienced radar officer working it at a range of 1.5 miles, at which point the forward gun crews had been eyeballing their shots in using regular scopes and binoculars. He also recommended that the 50-foot depth setting on depth charges not be used on corvettes. Vetch was now sporting hull leaks abreast 6 frames from one such charge, which she just physically hadn't been able to clear the blast radius of in time. That same blast had also temporarily jammed the rudder. There was a somewhat odd footnote to this particular engagement. Over the previous 3 months, 3 U-boats, U-82, U-587 and now U-252, had all reported that they were tracking Allied convoys west of the Bay of Biscay, and then each had promptly gone silent. In fact, each had been sunk by Allied escorts. The Kriegsmarine couldn't quite decide if this was due to high-frequency direction finding efforts, which in theory might just about be augmented by land-based stations at this range, if it was some kind of special trap or technology the Allies had set in this particular area of ocean, or if it was just bad luck. But in any case, the pickings on the other side of the Atlantic seemed to be much better, and so for the next few months U-boats were ordered to ignore convoys in this particular part of the ocean and just move on to the mid and western Atlantic. This ended up buying a number of convoys some much-needed reprieve. But, as May turned into June, things began to change. The convoys off the US East Coast finally began to get their escorts sorted out, and the losses of U-boats in that region therefore began to spike. Plus, of course, the Allies were gearing up for Operation Torch, and that meant there were some especially rich convoys running to and from Gibraltar, which was acting as the primary forward operating base for the invasion forces. This meant that renewed pressure on this particular convoy route would soon result as submarines were being pulled back from the US coast and redeployed. Walker had achieved his first bar to his Distinguished Service Order for the preservation of HG-82, But on June the 9th, having run back to the UK and then back to Gibraltar again in the interim, the 36th set out to escort convoy HG-84 back home. The group at this stage was further reduced by Vetch still being in dry dock for repairs, and so now it was Stork, Marigold, Convolvulus and Gardenia. 4 ships to escort 20 regular merchantmen, the convoy Commodore aboard the SS Pelavo, the Empire Morn, which was a catapult-armed merchant ship and as such had a one-shot aircraft available. It was a far cry from Audacity's 6 martlets, but it was better than nothing, and the SS Copeland, which would sail at the back of the convoy carrying not huge stocks of war supplies, but boarding nets, ropes, searchlights and medical equipment, for she was a designated convoy rescue ship, kitted out with a large up-to-date medical facility, wards and accommodation. Against him, though he didn't know it yet, Walker faced 9 U-boats, 5 in a picket line and then another 4 in a second line further north. With only 4 escort ships, Walker placed Marigold to starboard, Gardenia to port, and Stork up front, with Convolvulus taking the astern position during the day. Stork and Convolvulus would then swap places at night. 2 days after sailing, the Condors were out in force, but Walker kept his one-use fighter back for the moment. The next day, the 12th, 3 more ships joined the convoy, having sailed from Lisbon. The Condors continued to shadow the convoy over the next 2 days as they, obviously unknowingly, closed in on Wolfpack Endras, the line of 5 U-boats. By the 14th, Walker judged that based on the Condor's pattern of activity and his experience with HG-76, the enemy submarines had to be close, and so around lunchtime he ordered the catapult-armed merchantman to launch its Hurricane, trying to time his disruption of enemy air search efforts to best effect. This had somewhat mixed results. The rising seeds came with clouds, and the targeted Condor rather quickly fled into one of them, thus escaping destruction, as the Hurricane only had a chance to get off 2 quick bursts of machine gun fire before he lost his target. But it put a brief pause on Condor activity, and happily the pilot was able to ditch very neatly alongside a merchant ship and was duly picked up. Having patrolled the skies for around an hour after driving off the Condor, the pilot hadn't even fully dried out yet when at 1600 the Copeland reported an HF-DF line of bearing on a U-boat that was transmitting off the convoy's port aft quarter. As we've already seen, Walker had good reason not to send in escorts alone. But if he backed up Gardenia, which was the nearest ship to the contact, then half the escort force would be hunting behind the convoy, leaving it very exposed as the 2 ships would then have to fight to catch up. But a high-frequency direction-finding fix meant that there was little to no chance the U-boat knew it had been detected, as there was no plane circling overhead or any ship on the horizon, at least just yet. And so Walker ordered both Stork and Gardenia in immediately. It would take a couple of hours for them to reach the recorded position, which meant that even with an instant success, they wouldn't be back much before 10:30 in the evening, well into the dark hours, which was of course submarines' preferred hunting time. Luckily, Stork's lookout spotted the rather oblivious submarine on the surface, but as the ship then had to close to gun range, the submarine's crew came alive, spotted the oncoming escorts, and it was soon just using its surface speed to try and stay out of range and circle past the 2 incoming vessels. Stork, freshly refitted, had a roughly walking pace speed advantage, but this relatively slow rate of closure allowed the U-boat to time its actions quite easily, and just as Stork got under 14,000 yards away, which was almost into realistic gunnery range, the enemy vessel dived. It would now take about 20 minutes for Stork to reach the position of the dive, and in that time, the sub could have gone anywhere in an approximately 2-mile radius. Walker now had to outthink his opponent. Dead ahead, continuing on course, was unlikely. It was far too easy, far too obvious. The submarine therefore could have tried to cut to starboard, closer in towards the convoy, or to port, away from it. Recent U-boat behaviour suggested that the starboard option, aggressively cutting in towards the convoy and inside the escorts, was more likely. Walker therefore chose to adjust his course to port. Of course, if he was wrong, he'd just ordered his ship further away from a convoy whose unprotected flank the U-boat would now be closing on. But in just under half an hour after the U-boat had dived, he heard that he had an ASDIC contact. He had, in fact, outguessed his opponent. But the enemy, of course, also had a vote, and the sub now twisted and turned under the water. 5 sets of depth charges from Stork went down, and the sub was still alive. Gardenia caught up and launched its own pattern, but then one of these charges blew up almost immediately upon hitting the water, shredding the ship's ensign, which was of course at her stern, and damaging both her aft plating and her engine. Gardenia would now struggle to keep up with the convoy, but she was at least still seaworthy. After a few more attempts, and with only 18 depth charges of his own left, Walker directed Stork back to the convoy, as at this point it was already 2200. He decided to leave Gardenia to pursue the attack as best he could until either the submarine was sunk or the corvette also ran low on depth charges. Out on the starboard side of the convoy, there was also no escort, as Marigold had picked up a contact and then headed off to engage, following Walker's principles, catching the sub on the surface and then depth charging it 3 times before turning back with an ETA back to the convoy of around 1 in the morning. Convolvulus, left alone with the entire convoy to guard, had then detected yet another contact on the starboard bow of the convoy and chased off after that, which meant that, as midnight approached, the convoy was entirely without a close escort. Although, on the other hand, at least 3 U-boats had been suppressed, and of those, 2 of them almost certainly would not be able to return to attack that night, as their positions were now far too far aft. As 1 o'clock approached, it seemed that might have been enough. Convolvulus and Stork had managed to regain their stations. Gardenia would be some time, but Marigold should also be back any moment. But, as it turned out, she was delayed by about 15 minutes, and this proved deadly. U-552 had managed to sneak through the gap left by Marigold, and within minutes, the Pelavo, the Atrib, and the Slendal all went up in flames. With Marigold still somewhat aft of the convoy doing her level best to catch up and rejoin her station, Walker instead directed her and Copeland to rescue survivors. Walker then ordered the convoy lit up, but no subs were spotted, falling back. In fact, the German captains were testing out a new nighttime strategy, using superior surface speed to race back ahead of the convoy instead of falling behind it. At 0400, Stork detected a diving U-boat and dropped half her remaining depth charges, but there was no time to stick around and assess if that was actually a kill, and then at 0430 the Germans struck again, the ammunition ship Thurso vanishing in one almighty fireball, and then the city of Oxford came to a halt with somewhat more mundane major flooding. The merchant ships at this point panicked and started launching flares and rockets without orders, which of course lit themselves up for follow-up attacks. But none came. As devastating as the 5 ships sunk had been, the work of the overstretched escorts had limited the night's assaults to the exceptionally well-handled U-552, which had put in a second appearance. The escorts had managed to see off 4 submarines, and it seemed U-552 was the 5th from that first skirmish line. Walker pondered the wisdom of having ordered Marigold to go on survivor rescue duty. On the one hand, that second attack had come in from starboard, which is where Marigold would have been if she'd kept going in the aftermath of the first attack, and so possibly she would have seen the sub coming on radar. But on the other hand, if left to her own, Copeland would likely have had to fall well behind the convoy, picking up all the survivors single-handed, and thus risk being sunk herself, which would not only dump all those survivors back in the water, but also deny the general war effort a very valuable rescue vessel. Poor Gardenia now showed up, and as it was just before sunrise, but her ASDIC was crippled, she had no depth charges left, and she was only capable of 10 knots. Essentially, she was now a particularly heavily armed lookout, since she still did at least have her deck gun, but she was at least cautiously optimistic that she'd finished off her target. As it happened, she hadn't, it was just damaged. Knowing that without Allied air cover, the U-boats would probably spend the next day sailing past and ahead of the convoy up to the horizon, getting ready to attack again the next evening, Walker dropped back to help with the rescuing of survivors. Marigold was almost overloaded with 172 men pulled out of the water. Those who needed medical aid were gradually sent over to the Copeland, whilst Stork took aboard some of the uninjured in order to clear some space on Marigold's deck. This was just as well, as a late-running U-boat was spotted on the surface astern. Marigold rushed off to attack, and the U-boat made a run for it, again on the surface. This wasn't an ideal result, but at least it was going in the opposite direction to the convoy, which would make it a little bit more difficult for the sub to double back in the remaining daylight hours. That evening, a Liberator appeared overhead. Shortly thereafter, Stork spotted a U-boat in front of the convoy, and the bomber was directed to attack it. This drove the sub underwater, but soon the bomber had to leave. It was then a fraught night. Gardenia had no depth charges left, Stork and Marigold had 1 pattern each, and only Convolvulus had a decent number. But of course, the subs had no way of knowing that. Stork detected yet another U-boat astern. This was possibly the one that Marigold had run off earlier in the day, and around midnight she loosed her last depth charges at it. Convolvulus spotted another sub racing in from the starboard bow of the convoy and countercharged. The U-boat retreated. And then nothing. It seemed odd, but the next morning the welcome sight of a Catalina floated into view, and as the long-range aircraft orbited, Walker took the opportunity to transfer a dozen depth charges from Convolvulus by boat, 2 at a time, so that he would at least have something to use. But still nothing came. The afternoon wore on, and an old Whitley bomber droned by on the lookout to help the Catalina. Although they didn't know it, the vicious and rapid attacks by the escorts had convinced the Kriegsmarine that the convoy was in fact far more heavily protected than their intel of 4 ships suggested, and so they called off the entire U-boat assault. U-552 had to head home to reload in any case, but most of the rest of the subs had just wandered off into the mid-Atlantic to find resupply submarines to refuel and give their hand a go at another convoy in the future. This was probably just as well. Stork was now limping along as she was suffering from condensoritis, which reduced her to 1 engine and 9 knots. This meant that both Gardenia and Stork were only just about capable of keeping up with a convoy, let alone doing anything else. Now, however, the Germans played one last card. A full squadron of Junkers 88 bombers were dispatched with orders to sink the convoy and/or its escorts. But now, fortune and bravery saved them from further harm in the most unlikely fashion. About 50 miles to the east was the destroyer HMS Wild Swan. She was passing through a flotilla of Spanish fishing trawlers, and in the half-light that was present at about 9:30 that evening on the 16th of June, the German bombers thought that this loose mass of shipping was the convoy they'd been sent to attack, and so they promptly went after the largest ship they could see, the 1,100-ton geriatric Wild Swan. She was a modified W-class destroyer who had had her keel laid back when World War I was still being fought. She'd already served at and survived the Dunkirk evacuation before moving on to several years of convoy escort work. She now came under attack by the entire squadron of bombers, which approached in formations of 3. The poor destroyer had an aircraft armament that stretched to a single 12-pounder, or 3-inch anti-aircraft gun, and a pair of single 40mm pom-poms, plus any small arms and harsh language the crew might have. Well, surely she'd just be a speed bump. But instead, signalling that she'd sighted the bombers, she hoisted her battle flags and moved to engage. A vicious fight developed, and whilst inevitably the destroyer left it in a sinking condition and calling for aid to pick up her survivors, it wasn't before she'd somehow managed to rip half the German bombers out of the sky and send the rest packing with various levels of shrapnel damage, completely and utterly ruining what should have been HG-84's coup de grace. Most of the survivors would then be picked up by a Sunderland. And so, the convoy, unknowing of this, reached Liverpool without further assault, save for a single Condor who strayed a bit too close to the escort's guns and was forced to run for cover by streams of tracer rounds. Walker himself focused on the fact that he'd lost 5 of the merchant ships he was supposed to protect. His superiors, on the other hand, looked at the fact that the vast majority of the valuable sailors from those ships had been rescued, and the 36th had stood outnumbered more than 2 to 1 by U-boats, but managed to turn what should have been an absolute massacre into merely a thoroughly bruising experience. Walker worried he might be dismissed, but instead, by the end of the month, he'd actually been promoted to captain. Back at Western Approach's command, Admiral Noble had pushed for this advancement on 2 grounds. Firstly, Walker clearly deserved it. But secondly, Noble and others had noticed that Walker was driving himself to the absolute limit of exhaustion. Promotion could be expected to come with a spell ashore. Apart from anything, the few remaining ships of the 36th would need refitting and repairs for quite a while, and Noble hoped that this would give Walker a chance to relax and calm down a little. Officially, Walker was assigned as Captain D, or Captain Destroyers, Liverpool, which was naval shorthand for a position that meant he was in charge of the admin and training of all ships based in whatever location suffixed the D, in this case the port of Liverpool. Of course, to get him to settle in one place for more than a moment would require that Walker be kept in the dark as to the latter motive, otherwise he'd insist even more strongly than he already was that he should be back out at sea. Whilst running a campaign to get him back out there, he also applied himself with a will to the task of organising the escort ships sailing to and from Liverpool. He split his time between, on the one hand, Western Approach's command, where he pored over reports of convoy battles, coordinated with the women of the Western Approach's tactical unit in developing new tactics, and decided which commanders needed help, who needed promotion and rewards, and who needed to be relieved and sent elsewhere. On the other hand, you could also find him down in the dockyards, inspecting ships, cutting through red tape, seeing new equipment installed, and giving a significant amount of off-the-record advice to various officers and men. It soon became known amongst the escort ships based in Liverpool that if you acted decisively and with a degree of common sense, Walker would have your back, even if your actions didn't end too well. Dithering, however, would likely be the end of your efforts commanding escorts. In a rare lecture to newly inducted escort commanders on the topics of leadership and morale, he espoused the following. Leadership comes very much easier to those of strong personality, commanding presence, but don't fall into the mistake of thinking these things are essential. They are not. Nelson and Napoleon were both little squirts, and Hitler is, in my opinion, a figure of fun. Yet, Napoleon led a whole nation for some years all over Europe to eventual defeat, and Hitler is doing the same thing now. There is a distinction between leadership and discipline. An utterly undisciplined rabble was successfully led to storm the Bastille in 1789. Leadership without discipline. Conversely, I have watched a magnificently disciplined body of Royal Marines in a big ship expending foot-tons of energy in trivial exercises. Discipline without leadership. A well-led ship's company can be recognised in any emergency by their ready and intelligent anticipation of orders and the absence of confusion and shouting. I have seen a good many leave breakers, ship jumpers, drunks, etc., and I have a standard speech for them. I tell them what stinking skunks they are for helping the German war effort, doing their little best to lose the Battle of the Atlantic, miserably failing their country in her hour of need. Most of them are shaken to the core by it, some even burst into tears. You must get home to your men that there is no excuse for leave breaking. That is not merely playing truant from school, but letting their mates down badly. If a wife is ill or having a baby, the man must realise that his duty to his country comes before his duty to his family. Another cause of low morale is the difference in pay between the sailor and the dockyard and factory workers ashore. Rub in the honour of being picked for the finest fighting team in the world, and that the country would have been in German hands long ago, but for that team and his part in it. The summer and autumn of 1942 had not been kind to Allied escort efforts. While the entry of the USA into the war offered that nation's vast industrial resources to the Allied side, in the short term this had also expanded the area that needed to be covered to include the US East Coast and the entirety of the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. And although that period saw 32 U-boats sunk, 61 had joined the Kriegsmarine, which left the escorts stretched thin at about half the numbers that the projections indicated were needed for their new areas of responsibility. US yards were spooling up their production, but it would be a few months before the results were seen. Unsurprisingly, almost 400 merchant ships went to the bottom in this time period. Also during this time, Admiral Noble was sent over to Washington to work with the US Navy. His replacement at Western Approaches, Admiral Sir Max Horton, immediately sought out Walker for his opinions and ideas. Encouraged, Walker wrote up a series of reports pointing out that while a number of new escort carriers were coming online, there weren't enough to escort every convoy. But, as autumn turned into winter and the combined output of British, Commonwealth and American yards was making a dent in the demand for escort ships of all flavours, with the ability to provide a passable escort screen for any given convoy, Walker argued that an irregular use of escort carriers in close attendance, with maybe an additional corvette or frigate scattered here or there, might do some good, but it would be far better to take some of these new ships and form special groups which could roam freely or reinforce heavily pressed convoys at will, relatively unencumbered by the need to screen a slow convoy, and thus able to hunt down U-boats wherever they happened to be, unless the U-boats happened to be at the convoy. These groups could then be sent where the concentration of enemy subs was known to be the strongest. Instead of wolf packs calmly gathering and preparing set-piece ambushes that escort commanders had to grimly wait for, Walker wanted the submarine crews to be run ragged from pillar to post from the moment they cleared the range of Luftwaffe fighter cover to the moment they either run back underneath it, up to the French coast, or they were sent on their final dive by a barrage of depth charges, the ramming of an escort vessel, or perhaps the splash of the new Hedgehog mortars. Anywhere the U-boats felt safe, Walker declared, is where he wanted these hunting groups to be. By the start of 1943, with some input from other officers, the Admiralty had broadly approved this idea, but it was still anticipated that 1943 was going to be a grim one. Dönitz was now in charge of the Kriegsmarine, and the surface fleet had almost been scrapped thanks to its dismal performance at the Battle of the Barents Sea. This would no doubt see far more resources poured into the U-boat arm. Walker could read the writing on the wall so well you might as well have renamed him from Johnny to Daniel, and pressed Horton for a seagoing command. Realising he was at best fighting a holding action, Horton acquiesced, and he directed that the crew of Stork be largely transferred to a new vessel, which Walker would then take command of upon commissioning. And so it was that in mid-February 1943, an advanced party of Stork crewmen took a ride in an overnight, unheated and overcrowded train up to Glasgow, where they were introduced to job number SL11701, tucked away behind the much larger hull of a cruiser that was fitting out next to it. They began fine-tuning the setup of the ship's equipment in accordance with their experience, and over the next 6 weeks, what looked for all the world like a somewhat shattered rusting hulk that had been dredged up from some forgotten corner of the world, went through her final, startling transformation into a sleek sloop of war, hatching, if you like, on the 1st of April 1943 into HMS Starling. Walker gave a short commissioning speech, and Starling then headed south, originally headed for Liverpool. Walker had actually spent his last days as Captain D. Liverpool drafting up a speech inspired by the support he'd received from his wife Eileen, who'd come up to join him there some months previously. This was intended for an audience of Navy wives, mothers, and sweethearts, but the Admiralty had ultimately decided against broadcasting it, fearing that it implied that some men were lackadaisical or deserting. Luckily, most of Walker's planned speech survives in typed format. Walker, of course, was no less blunt ashore than he was at sea. One of the paragraphs, for example, reading, "We sailors all know that beastly moment when leave is over, and how it would be tempting to seize on some trivial excuse to stay a little longer. I am glad to say that most wives see to it that their husbands return to their ships in good time. I have this to say to those who have wavered. Never forget your influence on your man, and keep him up to the mark. Send him back from leave itching to get at Hitler's throat, not unhappy, worried, and anxious about his home. Your paramount duty is to help your husband, or son, or sweetheart grind the Nazi face back into the dirt from which it sprang." As Starling headed south, she conducted various exercises, speed, gunnery, sensors, etc., to help meld the large number of ex-Stork crew with the levy of new arrivals into a single cohesive and coherent mass. They were also in receipt of a signal from Admiral Houghton. He intended to form 5 support groups, the rather understated designation for Walker's hunting parties, although escort carriers were not immediately available. Starling and Walker would lead the 2nd support group, formed of similar classmates Wild Goose, Wren, Kite, Cygnet, and Woodpecker, who were themselves already headed out to sea and would meet the Starling off Londonderry before heading off into the Middle Atlantic. Walker issued his group operating instructions. Typically, an escort group's orders would open with a standard objective, the safe and timely arrival of the convoy. Walker's, however, read in part, "The object of the 2nd support group is to destroy U-boats. Our job is to kill, and all officers must fully develop the spirit of vicious offensive. No matter how many convoys we may shepherd through in safety, we shall have failed unless we can slaughter U-boats. All energies must be bent to this end." The first patrol picked up a convoy that was incoming from Nova Scotia. The appearance of 2nd support group seemed to have had a chilling effect on the U-boats, for none appeared after the 6 sloops took up their defensive formation. Their charges safely delivered to Liverpool, the group turned around, and after a brief period of shore leave, they headed out again. On the 21st of May 1943, they departed from Iceland after a quick stopover, heading roughly in the direction of another convoy that had signalled it needed help. The 1st of June 1943 dawned clear and sunny. Of course, that day, 149 years earlier, had marked the great victory of the glorious 1st of June when Admiral Howe, who now had a namesake battleship sailing the seas, had taken his 25 ships of the line into battle, capturing 6 enemy vessels and sinking another. But, as the sun rose, it seemed that it was going to be a fairly calm start to the month for 1943. And then, at 09:30, the telephone on the bridge rang. The high-frequency direction-finding operator had detected a U-boat transmitting about 20 miles away. With a grim smile on his face, Walker arrived on the bridge to find the whole 2nd support group heading at increasing speed in the direction of the contact. Starling's first hunt was about to begin.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.